lecture of the 2026 spring season of the Frankfort Heritage Lecture Series, our 32nd lecture overall. Thank you all for coming. My name is John Carlton, and I'm the organizer of the Frankfort Heritage Week Coalition and the co-organizer of this lecture series. As always, I want to extend a big thank you to the Paul Sawyer Public Library for hosting us, and to my co-organizer, Diane Dahoney, for everything she and her staff do for the lectures and the community. And of course, thanks to the Frankfort Plant Board and Cable 10 for recording the lectures and making them available on YouTube, and to the State Journal for consistently giving us some great additional publicity. We're also grateful to the Kentucky Historical Society's America 250 KY Commission for helping us officially present this series in the context of America 250. This month marks a particularly meaningful milestone. Today is the 100th anniversary of the establishment of Negro History Week, the predecessor to Black History Month, which began on February 7th, 1926, exactly 100 years ago today. One of the central goals of America 250 is to retell the American story in a way that reflects the experiences of all people, especially those lives and contributions that were long neglected, erased, or misrepresented. That process requires honesty, nuance, and a willingness to sit with historical complexity rather than simple narratives. Though the concept of race is a social construct, indigenous peoples were present on this continent for tens of thousands of years before modern Europeans arrived, and people of African descent were present in Spanish colonies as early as the 1500s, nearly a century before English colonial slavery began in Virginia in 1619. Throughout the 246-year period of slavery, thousands of communities of free people of color existed, building churches, schools, and mutual aid societies, and owning businesses and properties. These realities directly contradicted the prevailing narrative that people of color were incapable of rational thought or self-governance. Although the framers of the Constitution initially allowed slavery to persist, they used inclusive language such as "we the people." Abolitionists like Frederick Douglass later seized upon that language, arguing, "We the people, not we the white people, not we the privileged class, but we the people, the men and women, the human inhabitants of the United States." As we'll see later in this season, Douglass ultimately won that argument with important reinforcement from former Frankfort jurist Justice John Marshall Harlan, whose dissent in Plessy v. Ferguson declared that our Constitution is colorblind. But before that progress could occur, America endured a civil war, Reconstruction undermined by Jim Crow, countless lynchings, and the erasure of entire communities and histories from the record. These are the uncomfortable truths America 250 asks us to confront, to consider how our history shapes who we have been, who we are, and who we can become. It's an invitation to recommit ourselves to the ideals of liberty and equality under the law. Today's lecture embodies that complexity. Harry Mordecai was a highly skilled African-American plasterer and bricklayer who contributed significantly to Frankfort's built environment, including work associated with two of our national historic landmarks. Born enslaved, later a free person of color, and ultimately an enslaver himself, his life resists easy categorization. While uncommon in proportion, it was not rare for free people of color to own enslaved persons. Research by Carter G. Woodson indicates that in 1830, approximately 3,775 free black people owned roughly 12,907 enslaved individuals. These facts complicate our understanding of race, power, and survival within a deeply unjust system. This lecture also reminds us that our understanding of the past must evolve as new information comes to light. It is not only a story about one man, but about the practice of history itself. So please join me in welcoming Adult Services Manager Diane Dahoney, who will introduce today's speaker.
Good afternoon. Welcome to the Paul Sawyer Public Library. We're so happy to have you here this afternoon with us. As John said, my name is Diane Dahoney, and I am the Adult Services Manager here at Paul Sawyer. It is my great honor to introduce today's speaker, Sharon Cox, and I'd like to tell you a little bit about her as we bring her up to the podium. Sharon Cox and her husband, Mack, are collectors and independent scholars of early Kentucky material culture. Their collection has been published in the magazine Antiques, Collecting Kentucky 1790 through 1860 by Lacer and Howard, and others. Items from their collection have been exhibited at Colonial Williamsburg, Virginia, the Museum of Early Southern Decorative Arts in Winston-Salem, North Carolina, and in many Kentucky museums, including the Speed Art Museum, the UK Art Museum, Kentucky Governor's Mansion, and the Kentucky Historical Society. Sharon is a retired certified public accountant and served as president of Holt & Cox, PSC, a Lexington certified public accounting firm. She has served as past president of many civic organizations, including Liberty Hall Historic Site, the National Society of the Colonial Dames of America in the Commonwealth of Kentucky, the Lexington chapter of the National Association of Women Business Owners, and the Lexington Professional Women's Forum. She has served on the advisory board of the Museum of Early Southern Decorative Arts in North Carolina. Please help me to welcome today Sharon Cox.
Thanks.
Water. Is this yours?
This one's fine.
Okay.
Well, mine wasn't open. Yeah, so that starts. Okay. Thank you for that introduction. And what a wonderful opening, John. Let me make sure I'm on. I'm kind of new to this stuff, y'all know. Okay. The best description of Harry Mordecai is found in his January 1853 obituary. It was published in the Frankfort Commonwealth and written by its editor, Orlando Brown. Titled, Honor to the Lowly and Upright, it says, Harry Mordecai, from youth to old age, a much respected colored inhabitant of Frankfort, departed this life on Monday, January 3rd, 1853, aged about 70 years. He was born a slave and instructed by his master in the business of bricklaying, plaster, etc. By his energy, industry, and economy, he bought his own freedom and that of his wife and several children. Afterwards, he reared and supported a very large family and left at his death a very considerable estate for one in his humble position. He lived long, usefully, benevolently, and piously, enjoyed the confidence and respect of all who knew him, and died in the triumph of a Christian's faith. Mordecai's obituary doesn't reveal the specific contributions he made to Frankfort's built landscape. It didn't need to. Everyone then living in Frankfort already knew those things and had the pleasure of knowing Harry personally. Unfortunately, few public records document those things, and many of Frankfort's buildings during Harry's life have been destroyed. Family histories rarely document who built their homes. First, I do want to dismiss something that's a record I've seen on Ancestry about Harry that is clearly wrongly associated with him. That is a record that supposedly documents Harry as leasing slaves to the Confederate Army in 1863. Well, since Harry died in 1853, I think we're safe in scratching that record. So let's get started learning about Harry's life and work, beginning with the fact that he was born as Henry Mordecai, and Harry is a nickname. Both names are alternatively used in records, but Harry seemed to be used by his friends and his acquaintances, and I'm going to use Harry mostly today. According to Harry's 1850 census, he was born about 1784 in Virginia. That census lists him as mulatto. His parentage remains unknown, but Richmond, Virginia makes a lot of sense as his birthplace because his enslaver, Francis Radcliffe, was born in Virginia and served in the Revolutionary War from 1777 to 79 and was living in Richmond, Virginia in 1787. Francis worked on the construction of the Virginia State Capitol complex. He had to make an appeal to the Virginia House of Delegates to get paid for his work on those public buildings. This might be important later when we discuss the attribution of work on Kentucky's third capital, now called the Old State Capitol. Francis appears in Kentucky in 1796 with an approximately 11 to 12-year-old Harry Mordecai. And I'm on the wrong slide, so anyway. Okay. On November 3rd, 1796, Francis Radcliffe and George Rowland contracted with John Brown to build Liberty Hall, John Brown's Frankfort residence. We know this by their lawsuit for payment. Like Mordecai, the owner of Liberty Hall, John Brown, was from Virginia. After studying law at the College of William and Mary in Virginia, Brown read law under Thomas Jefferson. He represented Virginia in the Confederation Congress in 1788 to 1789 and was a U.S. congressman from Virginia from 1788 to 1792 when he introduced the bill for Kentucky's statehood. Upon statehood, he represented Kentucky as one of its first two United States senators from 1792 to 1805. Enslaved by Francis Radcliffe at the time, Harry Mordecai would have been 19 or 20 years old by completion of Liberty Hall and would have trained and assisted on the job. He likely learned to make bricks, mix brick mortar, lay bricks and mortar, and plaster the interior walls. Over that long 7 to 8 year construction period, Mordecai would have, as Orlando said in Mordecai's obituary, been fully instructed by Francis in the business of bricklaying and plastering. So Liberty Hall was the job where Mordecai apprenticed and became a skilled craftsman. John Haviland detailed the extent of services and methods that an early 19th century plasterer might perform in his book, The Builder's Assistant, published in Philadelphia in 1818. Several of the plaster motifs in the old Kentucky State Capitol were apparently adapted from Haviland's book. Thus, a copy was likely available locally during Mordecai's era. The basic purpose of a plasterer was to make level and smooth interior walls and ceilings that could be painted or papered. If the outside walls were brick or stone, the rough surfaces of the brick or the stone would yield a strong bond with the plaster. So the plaster could be applied directly to those surfaces. But on all ceilings and on wood-framed walls, the plasterer would first need to attach wood laths with nails like these. Two types of plaster were applied in two separate applications. The first, called the scratch coat, was made of lime and sand and water with animal hair mixed in to reduce cracking by increasing the tensile strength of the plaster. The wet plaster was applied with a trowel so that it squeezed through the gaps on the opposite side and became fixed to the lath work. Once applied and while still wet, the surface was scratched so that the final coat would adhere. This photo shows the completion of that scratch coat. Next came the finish application called fine stuff, which was pure lime and water. This diagram shows the complete process, including the laths, the scratch coat, and the finish coat. Beyond basic interior walls, a plasterer might be called upon to create cornice moldings, coffered ceilings, or decorative ornaments. Small moldings of plaster could be made using a trowel with one edge cut out in the profile of the molding. Larger moldings, such as cornices or coffered ceilings, were framed, Laths were installed, and they were plastered just like walls. Ornaments were made by creating a mold for casting plaster. Once hardened, the ornaments were attached to the wall and/or ceiling with wet plaster. Now recognized as a National Historic Landmark, Liberty Hall has been designated as one of the finest examples of federal architecture in Kentucky by architectural historian Clay Lancaster. He wrote, "The exquisite cornice carries left to right across the entire facade. The brickwork of Liberty Hall is laid in Flemish bond with 5 bays, the central 3 of which are 3 3/4 inches proud from the outer 2. Flemish bond is a common brick pattern used in Georgian architecture. The belt course is 4 bricks deep, and the molded brick water table is pronounced. The chimneys are substantial, with decoratively corbelled tops consisting of the tops having 4 or 5 rows of bricks that step out from the base, topped with another 4 or 5 rows of bricks that step in toward the cap. Mordecai's involvement in the original plaster interior walls of Liberty Hall is reinforced by the fact that he was called on to do subsequent work, as evidenced by this 1835 letter from John Brown's wife, Margaretta, to her daughter-in-law, Mary Watts Brown, the wife of the Browns' eldest son, Mason. Margaretta wrote, "We have all, including Mary and Harriet, taken possession of your room, as mine is dismantled, and awaiting the pleasure of Harry Mordecai to commence whitewashing. I hoped to avail myself of the absence of all of the males of the family to have the house put in order, but I fear Harry's dilatoriness will defeat my object." These are the very walls Margaretta referred to in that 1835 letter. Mordecai's enslaver, Francis Radcliffe, died in Frankfort in 1814 when he was about 60 years old, resulting in Mordecai then being enslaved by Francis Radcliffe's estate. Neither Francis Radcliffe nor his estate freed Mordecai, but George Radcliffe did in 1816, which was as soon as he had the authority to do so, suggesting that George and Harry, who grew up together, had a close relationship. While Orlando told us that Harry purchased his own freedom, the odds that that final amount due to Radcliffe just happened to coincide with the settlement of his enslaver's estate seems unlikely. Therefore, I believe it's more probable that he had paid off the vast majority of that debt, but that George forgave that remaining balance due. George was a store clerk, so he had no need to enslave a plasterer and bricklayer. Yet he, as executor of his father's estate, inherited Harry, but no other enslaved persons. That emancipation was recorded in Frankfort in 1817. 17 years after Harry's emancipation, Mildred Tunstall emancipated Harry's second wife, Patsy, and their children, James, Charles, Servilia, Eugenia, and Catherine. We know that Harry purchased Patsy's and her children's freedom because Orlando told us that too, which supports Harry as an emancipator. While Kentucky's 1798 slave code prohibited hiring out enslaved workers, many slaveholders ignored the statute. Different methods of slave hiring were described in A History of Blacks in Kentucky, From Slavery to Segregation, 1760 to 1891, by Marion B. Lucas. Lucas tells us that many small farmers rented slaves from neighbors on an informal basis for a day, week, perhaps a month. on a more formal basis, drawing up contracts and stipulating all the conditions. Owners might auction their services to the highest bidder on the first day of each year. Almost every sizable town, from the mountains to the Mississippi River, held slave hiring auctions on the public square. A third method that Lucas cited was enlisting agents on a commission basis. Some enslaved individuals made arrangements with owners that permitted them to find and negotiate their own work and pay owners a fixed sum. This is likely the process that Harry used, thereby paying Francis Radcliffe toward the purchase of his freedom. In antebellum Frankfort, Kentucky, freedom for a free person of color was quite different than that for a white person. Historian Louis J. Bilardo, Jr. wrote in 1975 about a special census of Frankfort's free blacks, who were called before the city's Board of Trustees in July 1842 to assess their threat to the white population, which Bilardo described as follows. At that meeting, the free black inhabitants of Frankfort, they could hardly be called citizens, were examined, and Frankfort whites spoke either on their behalf or to their detriment. Notations on each family were entered into a small, soft-covered book. A number of blacks were expelled from the city. One was arrested, and others were warned to change their behavior or receive like punishment. The strangest thing about that examination is that in some cases, persons with favorable recommendations from white citizens were punished anyway. Although only portions of this small soft-covered book survived into the last quarter of the 20th century, Bilardo transcribed what was available. That transcription includes this entry for Harry Mordecai and reveals a household that included his third wife, 5 of their children, a grandchild, and an unrelated enslaved person. This record supports Harry as an enslaver himself, as there are no records yet found that show any relationship between Harry or the Mordecais and inventor Jones. 8 years later, the 1850 United States Census recorded the Mordecai household as Harry and Rachel with 4 of their children and a 13-year-old boy born in Mississippi named Elam Miller. Miller was Rachel's child, who was born before she and Harry married. These individuals made up the free people in the Mordecai household. The 1850 United States slave schedule recorded 4 enslaved people in the Mordecai household. Their names or relations to Harry are not given. On Harry's first tax report after attaining freedom, he, or the revenue agent taking down the data, listed him in the white males column, probably because the black columns might have resulted in him being taxed for owning himself. It appears that the Frankfort property tax assessors in those days, being in a small town, just fixed that for the future assessment bills because he was only listed in the white column in that first year. The first Kentucky Capitol building was completed 2 years after statehood, so in 1794, and operated in Frankfort from then until it was destroyed by fire in 1813. The second was built by 1816 and operated until it too was destroyed by fire in 1824. The third, which we now call the Old State Capitol, was designed by Gideon Schrock, a Lexington architect. Schrock was 25 years old at the time, and it was his first building. Construction was from 1827 to 1830, and it was the home of the Kentucky General Assembly until 1910. Other structures credited to Schrock include Old Morrison Hall at Transylvania University in Lexington, the Orlando Brown House here in Frankfort, and the Jefferson County Courthouse in Louisville. and also the old state capitol house at Little Rock, Arkansas. Of the structures I'll discuss today, Kentucky's old state capitol has by far the most elaborate plasterwork. The plasterwork throughout the old state capitol was credited as being the work of Harry Mordecai. This assignment was based upon an oral tradition that the descendants of Mordecai had the molds their ancestor used in performing that work, but those molds were destroyed in the 1937 flood in Frankfort. The earliest publication of that tradition is found in a footnote to a journal article published by the Kentucky State Historical Society in July 1945, entitled "The Capitals of Kentucky" by Bayless E. Hardin, which tells us that in 1897, a large section of the ornate ceiling of the House of Representatives fell. This work was put up in 1861, the original design being followed by A. McGrath, one of the finest workmen of his day then living here. The original work was put up by Henry Mordecai, and the original molds were in the possession of his descendants until destroyed by a flood a few years ago. Although this attribution to work in the House of Representatives is only to work in the House of Representatives, at some point it became an attribution to all of the plasterwork throughout the building, and especially the ornate plasterwork. Due to lack of an easy list of work that Harry did, researchers are left to find the hints, and early researchers have collectively grasped at straws to find those hints, as we still do today. That means we made mistakes by making assumptions, and this is one of those mistakes. I'm sure it made perfect sense at the time, because Harry is referenced many times in various writings by Frankfort residents as a prominent plasterer, so why wouldn't Harry do it? And if he did the work in one room, surely he did all of the plaster. The ornate plastering designs in the House of Representatives are similar to those throughout the entire structure. We do know that the state paid Harry for plastering and other work prior to commencement of work on the old state capitol. Here are payments the state made to Harry between 1815 and 1829, which covers the period prior to and during the early part of construction on the old state capitol. Some payments from 1815 to 1825 appear to be for work done on the second state capitol. The payments during construction of the third capitol are noted as rebuilding the capitol, but are too small to represent plastering a room in the third capitol, and more likely are lagging payments for repairs on the second capitol. In addition to the lack of any substantial payments to Mordecai during the construction of the building we now call the Old State Capitol, in the Journal of the House of Representatives in 1828, the commissioners noted that Mr. Schrock believes that to complete the portico, dome, and interior workmanship, the sum of $20,000 will be sufficient. The majority of that plasterwork appears to have occurred in 1830, because at the end of that year, the commissioners commented that the expenses exceeded the estimates, primarily because the ornamental plastering was much more expensive than had been estimated. Most significantly, the legislature approved an act in 1831 instructing the Auditor of Public Accounts to pay the ornamental plasterer, William S. Shackelford, the sum of $232.03 for the balance due said Shackelford for all the materials, plain and ornamental plastering, and every other claim arising out of his contract for plastering the Capitol. The legislators also authorized subsequent payments to Shackelford as per account. These payments were lagging balances due to Shackelford not for the full cost of the plaster work. As we already know, the estimated cost was $20,000, and that the costs actually exceeded that. The old state capitol plastering job was too large a job for any one plasterer or even a small crew. Shackelford held the contract and would have hired others to do the work, just as a home builder hires craftsmen and subcontractors to do much or all of the work on a house. And the contractor would oversee and be responsible for all of the work. The contractor is also responsible for paying the subcontractors and then must collect from the customer. So the contractor takes a financial risk, as did Francis Ratcliffe when working on the Virginia State Capitol complex. While Harry would have been a likely choice for the legislatures, as he was there in Frankfort and well known as an excellent plasterer, we do know that they chose William Shackelford for the project. Perhaps the choice was political, or perhaps it was the choice of the architect, Gideon Schrock. Or maybe Harry chose not to bid on the work, knowing the financial hardship that Francis endured when working on the Virginia State Capitol complex discussed earlier. So going back to that original attribution to Harry by Bayless Hardin, he and the Mordecai family never claimed that Harry did all of the plain and ornamental plastering in the old state capitol, but rather just that Harry did the plastering, both plain and ornamental, in the House of Representatives, which is this room. Without any record of payments made by Shackelford, we cannot ascertain with any certainty who did actually any of the plaster work anywhere in the Capitol. It is possible the family's reference to the old state capitol may have referred to the second state capitol rather than the third, or that attribution to the House of Representatives in the old state capitol may be accurate. But we can't prove it to be true or false at this point. We can only say that it was possibly the work of Harry Mordecai and cite the sources that we have. If anyone here today has any information that might tell us about any of Shackelford's work or have a ledger of his payments or know how we could get it, let's talk. We do know of some work Harry and others did on the second capitol, but further research is required to identify it, any more specifically than I have. More research is also needed on craftsmen who worked on Kentucky's first state capitol, also in order to credit those craftsmen. As a start on the second state capitol, I will direct you to the 1815 Journal of the Kentucky House of Representatives, page 215. Some of the names are Bowling and Long, Hunt and Blanton, Kennedy and Ware, Richard Taylor Sr., Matthew Jeffries, and William Samuel. Harry Mordecai plastered the Secretary's office in the second state capitol. Elias M. Crane plastered the Treasurer's, Auditor's, and Registrar's office. And Alexander Andrews painted and glazed the walls. The ornamental plasterers working in the old state capitol would not have come up with their designs for the ornamental plastering work they did. Schrock or Shackelford probably chose them from Haviland's book. Several plaster motifs in the old Kentucky State Capitol were apparently adapted from Haviland's book discussed earlier. Here you can see that the ornamental plaster in the rotunda at right and detailed at upper left is like that in Haviland's book at lower left. The Orlando Brown House was built between 1835 and 1836 in the Greek Revival style and designed by Gideon Schrock, the same architect as Kentucky's old state capitol. Having provided for his firstborn son, Mason, to inherit Liberty Hall, Senator John Brown divided his 4 acres between his 2 sons. He built a second house in 1835 to 36, adjoining Liberty Hall, for his second son, Orlando. Orlando graduated from Princeton University and Transylvania University's law school. He first practiced law in Alabama, then in Frankfort. He was the owner and editor of the Frankfort Commonwealth newspaper, and he authored Harry's obituary. In that paper, he served as Kentucky's Secretary of State under Governor John J. Crittenden and as the United States Commissioner of Indian Affairs during Zachary Taylor's presidency. According to this record in the Orlando Brown papers at the Filson Historical Society, in about 1835, Harry Mordecai was paid $567.75 for plastering at the Orlando Brown house. That record reported Joseph Gale was paid $380.75 for plastering work, and Isaiah Marshall $175 for painting, glazing, etc. This document does not include the entirety of the cost of building Orlando's house, as some items on the list are even stated as second accountings of payments. Further proving additional work and payments to Harry, in Orlando's several months later letter to his father, also at the Filson Historical Society, says, "All the rooms on the side next Mrs. Love, including the L, are now ready for plastering. The kitchen and room above it are lathed, the passage floor below is laid, and the floors in the upper room above the drawing rooms are laid. The windows and the washboards are nearly laid down. Everything is now going on with dispatch. Harry has his mortar prepared and will commence operations in a day or two." The plaster work at the Orlando Brown house was the basic work of creating level and smooth walls and ceilings suited for painting or papering that Haviland detailed. The fact that the plaster on those walls is still indeed level and smooth and remains so nearly 200 years later is a tribute to the fastidious work of the plasterer and is reason enough to celebrate Harry Mordecai's craftsmanship. Undoubtedly, Mordecai was responsible for the brick and plaster work of many more central Kentucky structures, but records for such work rarely survive. Matters of faith were as important to Mordecai as business success, if not more so. He and his family were members of the St. John African Methodist Episcopal Church in Frankfort, or St. John AME. This was Frankfort's first AME congregation, formed in 1839. The original church building was constructed that same year. It stood at the corner of Clinton and Lewis Streets. The land for the church had been given to Benjamin Dunmore and Benjamin Hundley by Rebecca Anderson Triplett, a white woman for whom Dunmore and Hundley worked. In the 1840s, the land and church were deeded in trust to Harry Mordecai and George Harlan. Dr. Robert Strode's dissertation on the history of St. John AME tells us, as to the ministers prior to 1865 who served St. John, it is not clear whether they were free men or servants of the white slave owners, because Harry Mordecai and George Harlan were ministers given the property where St. John is currently located. Well, we do know that Harry was free long before the church was established. This reference to Mordecai as a minister of the church may have come from the church's records, although he may have also just served as a minister in its broader definition, meaning attending to the needs of the congregation. We know from Dr. Strode that Mordecai served a leadership role at St. John AME until 1850, when Reverend Henry Henderson became the pastor. This is an image of the church as it stands today at 210 Clinton Street in Frankfort. This building was built in 1893. And this is a map with the original building, which was on the same ground. Harry Mordecai likely played a major role in the construction of this original building. Tax lists and census records over the years record the presence of any number of African Americans in Harry Mordecai's household, reflecting his growing family and Mordecai himself as an enslaver. We know from his obituary that he purchased his freedom and that of many of his family members, but we do not have any records to prove that he freed any of the enslaved men listed in his tax records. He may have provided them with the same opportunities Ratcliffe gave him to purchase his own freedom. To purchase his family's emancipation, Mordecai may have sold all of his assets, since he doesn't appear on the Franklin County tax lists again for 2 years. Patsy died less than 10 years later, and Mordecai had married Rachel. When his family was recorded among the free blacks in 1842, his brick and plaster work businesses provided enough for him to purchase 3 town lots in 1852, as well as owning 9 horses and a cow, totaling $2,525 of taxable value. His January 2nd, 1853 will, the day before he died, dispensed an estate that provided for his wife Rachel's needs during her lifetime and vested title of all of his property for the benefit of his children. This is another view of Harry's house. Okay. This State Journal article published November 27th, 1927, titled "Circus Lot Was on Washington Street," gives a tour of Washington Street, including a listing for the home of Harry Mordecai, which would have been here. It passed to Rachel after his death and then to his son, Charles Henry Mordecai. The article described the house as Aunt Rachel's home. And here it is in context of the town. Note how close his home is to the Capitol. This area of town was called Freestown for Mary Carroll Frees, an Irish Catholic resident who in the 1840s built and rented tenement houses on Ann High and Miro Streets to African Americans. It was populated by many free African Americans in the day. So you'd think that that was the source of Freestown. Maybe both were. Perhaps Harry's children and their offspring are his most lasting and important legacy. When Orlando said Harry had a very large family, he wasn't exaggerating. He married 3 times. With his first wife, he had Samuel Mordecai. We know of this marriage because of Samuel's own marriage record, which states his parents were Harry and Mary Mordecai. This is Harry's family, including grandchildren. Harry, Mary, and their son Samuel were first, followed by Harry and his second wife Patsy and their 5 children: Charles, James, Servilia, Eugenia, and Kitty. Then Harry and Rachel, with Rachel's son, Elam Miller. And all of them had a few kids too. This is a picture of 3 of Harry Mordecai's descendants. On the left is Harry and Patsy's daughter, Eugenia Mordecai Yiser. And on the right is Eugenia's daughter, Maria Yiser Hill Page. And in the middle is Maria's daughter, Edith Y. Hill. So Harry's daughter, granddaughter, and great-granddaughter are imaged here. And all 3 became school teachers. This is Mordecai descendant Jacqueline Ridley, whose diligent work in uncovering the story of Harry Mordecai is well known to most of you by her article, Harry Mordecai, Ancestor and Artisan. Harry's children benefited from Harry's care, instruction, impeccable reputation for honesty, and a bit of humor, as evidenced by this 1874 article in the Kentucky Gazette entitled "Mordecai, the Fishest," which said, One day last week, Charles Mordecai of this city, that's Harry's son, caught a buffalo fish in the Kentucky River near Mr. E.H. Taylor's distillery, which weighed 25 pounds. This is said to be the largest buffalo ever caught out of this river. But the greatest wonder about this catch remains to be told. Mordecai caught this 25-pounder with an unbaited minnow hook, which he just happened to be throwing carelessly about in the water near the distillery. Moreover, fishing luck seems to run in the family. The father of Mordecai, that being Harry, being known as the man who some years ago caught 2 fish at one pull with the same hook. Altogether, therefore, we captionize our present fish story as one hard to beat, especially as every fact stated is vouched for by one of the most reliable gentlemen and keenest fishermen in this city. So whenever you're having a bad day, month, year, just remember the enormous odds against Harry and his family, yet they still managed to succeed financially, to be kind, to help others, to enjoy life, and to tell a whopping good fish story. Thank you to all those who helped contribute this, and thank you.
Does anybody have any questions? Yes, sir.
Oh, hey, John. Oh, hello. Hi. I'm Jane Julian, and I was interested in the whitewashing. You said Margaretta wrote a letter where she talked about she had hired Harry Mordecai to whitewash the interior of rooms. So was that the normal thing that was done after the plasterers had finished?
Normally, right.
They didn't have white paint, they just whitewashed the interior?
That's correct. They would normally whitewash it as the paint. That would be the substitute for paint in the day, or they would paper it, either one.
Yeah.
But normally, for one of those two.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome. Where is the first capitol? It's no longer standing.
Oh, it's gone, that's right.
Yeah. Neither of them are, only the third capitol is.
What's the second? That's the old Capitol.
The old capitol now is actually the third capitol. Yeah.
Oh, then this one that we have now is the fourth.
Uh-huh.
Oh, okay.
Uh-huh. Any?
Did he ever sign anything? Could he write? Or
Yes,
was there,
he could write, he could read, he could write, yes. And he did sign things. Mhm.
and what would he have signed? On the plaster itself in the building? Or?
Oh, no, he never signed his work. Sorry, none of them did. Gosh, I wish they had. Yeah, no, but he did sign paperwork and things, and he could read and write, and all of that. He was very prolific at that.
Anyone else?
Yeah, well, he did, they don't really have any time frame that they set aside, like that he went to a school or that sort of thing. But he did, Francis Ratcliffe, his enslaved, the first one we know of, okay, and the one who brought him to Frankfort, had lived in Virginia. Virginia had laws back then, and I just learned this recently, actually, because they're doing a new exhibit on this and called the Virginia Untold Story, if you want to go look at it. But they had requirements that the all owners, enslavers, had to educate their children and their slaves. They had to teach them reading, writing, and math. Those were the rules. So,
Is Harry buried in either one of our cemeteries here?
yes, he is buried. I think he's buried in the Frankfort Cemetery. Am I right about that? Who knows that? Okay.
I'm not sure
Okay.
where.
Somewhere I had a reference of him in the Frankfort Cemetery, but I didn't find the gravestone.
Jackie's descendant, Jackie Ridley, is a friend of mine.
Yes.
She lives in Maryland. And she thinks he was buried in the cemetery that was removed for the transportation building. That's where she thinks he was buried, but she has no proof of that.
Okay.
The reason being that it was close to Washington Street and there was a black section there.
You know, that makes perfect sense.
And it stopped use about 1855. All right, anyone else? And didn't, Sheila, isn't his son buried in Green Hill? I think so.
Since we're going there. So curious, the law that they couldn't rent out their slaves. That slave owners couldn't rent out their slaves?
No, there was no law of that.
That was the way I understood what you were talking about early on in your talk.
I'm not aware of a law that.
Well, I just misunderstood it then.
Uh-huh.
You said it was improper. You said it was improper to lease or rent out the labor of your slaves, yet it was done in every
Other.
courthouse from the mountains to.
Yeah, no, they held auctions and did that. I think I said that, did I not?
You said that, but
Okay.
you said that on the front side, even though it was illegal to do so.
Oh, I got you. Yeah. Okay, so it was illegal to do so, but they did it anyway. I'm sorry.
All right, we got time for one more question.
His wives died, the early ones, when he had 3 wives?
Yes.
The first 2 died?
Yes. Patsy died very early, and then the very first one, I don't know if she died. I don't know what happened to her. I don't even know what her last name was. You know, I just know that Samuel is not of the other 2 families, and his mother's name was Mary, and his father's name was Harry Mordecai. You know, that's all I know about her. So, yeah.
Thank you, Sharon. Thank you all for coming.
Yeah, thank you.
And before you all head out,